Stanford University.
See, that's the other reason I like short intros. It gives me more time to talk. Okay, so this is what I'd like to talk about today is really the demand side of the market. And what's happened in the last 20 years is the introduction of wholesale markets throughout the United States. In most of the areas, certainly all the blue states have formal wholesale markets, and so for the most part, except for the desert Southwest and the South, there's formal wholesale markets that set prices at least on an hourly basis. And the unfortunate thing about most of these markets is there's very little demand side participation. Final consumers really aren't active participants in the market, which makes it very difficult for these markets to work well. Now, the nice thing is my first bullet point, which is things are changing. And the reason that things are changing is because of the fact of the desire to scale the amount of renewables in the system. And that's what's really, before as an advocate of active participation of consumers in the market, I would typically get a pat on the head and essentially sent out of the room. But now, because of this issue with intermittency, there seems to be much more interest in this. And so what I'd like to talk about is, I guess, is three necessary conditions. And a lot of the research that we've been doing at the Program on Energy and Sustainable Development over on the east side of campus is having to do with essentially these getting a better understanding of these initial conditions. So the first thing I wanted to talk about was the information experiment that we've done, sort of trying to show that, look, people need to understand a lot of things about electricity that they haven't formally understood in order to be better, if you like, more sophisticated consumers. The next we'll talk about is dynamic pricing. We need to get prices right, and that's why the green words, dynamic pricing, green is good. The red is what we don't want, time of use pricing. And we'll talk a bit about why that's the case, and that'll come out to be what's due to the fact of what's called symmetric treatment of load and generation. And then I'll tell you about a dynamic pricing experiment we've done, and then talk a bit about some other things that we're interested in with respect to what's called day ahead versus real-time dynamic pricing. And here it really is, if you like, manual intervention versus automated intervention. And really, it's the combination of these two things that's going to make things work best. So the reason that I think active participation is becoming essential is the renewable energy goals and the fact that renewable energy typically comes when it's available. This just gives you some ideas from California. During the July 2006 heat storm, when we hit the system peak on the system, less than 5% of the installed wind capacity in the state was operating. The other thing is that wind and solar are both very positively correlated across locations in California. In other words, a very good predictor of no wind at your location is no wind at someone else's location. And that's not very good for essentially managing the system. So this is really driving the need, or as I like to say, high wholesale prices don't cause more wind or solar energy, except more wind outside of Sacramento. But basically, that's the problem. So demand's got to step in and manage that. And this just gives you an idea of how much variability in load we can have within a day. It can go from roughly about 25,000 megawatts to almost double that amount of 50,000 megawatts within the day. This was taken from the system peak day. And the unfortunate thing is that the wind pretty much comes, as you can see, opposite. This just gives you each of these wiggly lines is the hourly output of the wind units in the Tehachapi region. And for the most part, this is a fairly common pattern in California. They pretty much come in the middle of the night rather than in the middle of the day. Solar, this is the daylight hours from 7 a.m. you can see to roughly about 7 p.m. But the thing you can see here is just a lot of variability. I mean, the clouds go by, the solar energy goes away. That's certainly not how people consume electricity, as you saw back here. So what we have to have is essentially people willing to be responsive, storage technologies, generating units that want to essentially stand by ready to go. The other thing is that we just trimming the peak of the system. The nice thing about the way the peak works in California is that it's a very small fraction of the hours of the year that we use a significant amount of capacity. So roughly about 5,000 megawatts gets used, less than essentially 2% of the hours of the year. This is, and moreover, that's likely to get even more to be the case, simply because, as you can see, the yellow line is the average daily peak load over the summer, whereas the blue line is the single hour peak load, and clearly that thing's much more volatile than the average. And we have to have sufficient capacity to meet the peak. So the basic point being is just simply that this very peaky demand, we can lop off a lot of that peak demand with using prices. Right now, we charge the same price to all customers pretty much all hours of the day. And by how we price, we can probably lop off that. Most of the time, the units that are being used are quite dirty and certainly have carbon implications that aren't the best. So there's a carbon benefit as well to this sort of dynamic pricing. So the only problem is that no one likes to respond to prices. That's sort of the standard problem. But that's what makes markets work. These are quotes that I've taken from a PUC commissioner who will remain nameless, but knows who they are. And the other thing is that there are a few beneficiaries in the regulatory process that receive benefits. In other words, the regulatory staff, the fact that consumers are responding to price, their role becomes less, not more. Generation unit owners, their role, they certainly would far prefer to sell against a not very sophisticated demand rather than a very sophisticated demand. And similarly for distribution, only customers receive benefits, but they're difficult to convince them that these benefits exist and they can realize them. And part of that is the information, as we'll discuss. The final point is the lack of hourly metering, is that in order to charge you for it, I need to measure it. And if all I can do is measure your meter at the beginning of the month, your meter at the end of the month, I don't know when you consumed what you consumed, so I have no way of essentially setting a dynamic price to you or allowing you to actively participate, because essentially, if you reduce your demand in the middle of the night when the price is zero, or you reduce your demand in the middle of the day when the price is $5,000, your monthly bill has the same change. And that's simply because of the fact we can't measure what you consume, so we can only bill you for your monthly consumption. Now, the nice thing is that the technology of hourly meters is changing. California has been quite aggressive in terms of installing interval meters, in spite of a few not so good implementations by at least one of the utilities. But basically, we've got these meters in place. Now we need essentially prices and information so that customers can take the necessary actions to make them work. So the first thing is really people have to change. Electricity has to become much more like other goods. We just have to become a bit more sophisticated in how we think about consuming electricity. The big problem is that you don't eat electricity. What happens is it's essentially a derived demand from the consumption of services, like, for example, as I wrote here, television, washing clothes, using computers, charging my car, those sorts of things. And essentially, I need to have an understanding of how actions translate into dollars. Like, for example, I go in to buy a hamburger. I know I buy that hamburger. My action of buying the hamburger cost me $2. I know what eating the hamburger is going to do to me in terms of my hunger. In the case of electricity, I don't really know, well, gee, watching television for one more hour, how much does that cost me in terms of electricity? I don't really have a great idea about that. But understanding that is necessary when those prices, if I am exposed to dynamic prices. So, the other thing that complicates this process is what's called nonlinear pricing, in that most utilities charge consumers according to a nonlinear price schedule, which means that the marginal price that I face depends upon the level of consumption that I have. So this just gives you an example of a couple of this is from the Sacramento Municipal Utility District. These are two from the Southern California Edison service territory. And you can see, even in this case, even for SMUD, the price almost doubles. Here, the price, almost triples from the lowest tier to the highest tier. So where you are on this tier really is going to impact your decision as to whether or not you'd want to take some action, because that action is costing you at a price that could be 3 times the price if it were on the lower tier. So the other thing that's a necessary condition besides the meters and the information is you got to have the prices. The prices are essentially what make the business case work. They are essentially the source of benefits by the fact that if I buy low, I sell high, that's the source of the economic benefits. There's no source of economic benefits for me of installing a storage technology if every kilowatt hour I consume is the same price. And so what I need is kilowatt hours that vary by the time of day that I purchase them, or the system conditions when I purchase them. And so what I need is essentially the meters to meter it, and I also need to understand how that works. And essentially the dynamic retailing prices are going to make storage viable. But again, to make storage viable, I'm going to need to be able to measure when I consumed it, when I stored it, and then also essentially how these actions work. So it is this combination of the meters, the information, and the pricing that really is going to make this stuff go. And that's really what one of the things we're interested in. So recently we partnered with 2 California utilities to essentially address this question of information, thanks as well to a grant from the California Air Resources Board. And so what we did was we wanted to say, okay, that nonlinear price schedule you saw, depending upon where the customer is on that price schedule, an action that consumed 1 kilowatt hour occurs dollars at a rate that could be 1 to 2 times to 3 times higher, depending upon where the customer is on that schedule. So one of the things that we wanted to make sure that the customer understood is we said, look, we want to give you what we'll call an information treatment that is going to show you what a nonlinear price schedule is and essentially where they are on that schedule in the months preceding the intervention that we gave them. And then we want to take an inventory of the customer's electricity consuming durable goods. So we'd ask them a number of questions about what sorts of electricity consumer durable goods they have in their household. And then based on that, we then had suggestions for energy savings that the customer could implement. And they had the ability to try different things, and essentially was very interactive, designed by 2 of the folks right there. Excellent survey. I highly recommend you take it. We can post the link to there. And essentially allowed the customer to consider many options. And the customer was then sent, after he'd gone through and committed to things that he would do, we sent them essentially a follow-up PDF with their commitments. And the way we solicited customers is we basically did a treatment and control group, random sample of customers were drawn, and essentially we then selected customers in the treatment group and then solicited them by mail in one case and email in another case. And we offered them varying amounts of Amazon gift cards to participate. And consistent with the good economics, the higher you paid them, the more people you got. So very comforting to an economist. And so both for the treatment and control groups, we had their consumption the 6 months before, their consumption the 6 months after, and essentially just analyze the impact of this intervention of information. Now, an important factor that would affect this information is where I am on the schedule is probably going to change what I might likely to do. In particular, if I learn that I'm on one of those low tiers, I might say, gee, I'm still facing a pretty low marginal price, I can consume a little more. But if I'm on the high tier, I'm likely going to say, ooh, I'm on that high tier, I probably want to cut back in some of the discretionary activities that I might have that use electricity. And interestingly, and so this is just a case, again, of repeating the SMUD schedule. And what we found was pretty much evidence consistent with that. In particular, the folks that we told, you're on the low tier initially, what we found is they actually pushed up as a result of the fact that they got that information. Whereas the folks that are on the high tier, relative to the folks in our control group, they reduced their consumption. And so essentially, but the good news was at least the overall net effect of the information was essentially a predicted reduction in the aggregate consumption, largely because the higher tiers consume more, and there's slightly a bit more of them in the population of customers for the utility. Now, the interesting thing is, did this continue to hold for the utility that had 5 tiers? And in other words, the information of where you are on the schedule. So this was the schedule for the other utility we worked with, which was Edison. And essentially, we told the customer where they were on this tier before the intervention. And then we looked to see what happened. And sure enough, similar effect occurred in the sense that people that were on the very low tier at the very low marginal price, they were like, hey, I got a lot left at that low price. The people at the very high marginal tier, they said, ooh, I'm paying it roughly 31 cents. I better cut back. That's far more expensive than my willingness to pay for essentially the marginal consumption that I get. So again, and even it was, as we could see, larger in absolute magnitude increases for the lower tiers. And so at least we take away from this, there's a bunch of other things that we've done with respect to this of different ways of breaking out these sorts of things. But the basic point is that the information provision certainly appears to be an important factor in allowing the customers to figure out what to do with their electricity. That in particular, much to my surprise, as I am, after all, a very cynical economist and even cynical of economics, I was very surprised at the fact that the degree of rationality in what we saw in terms of the results. So we need to essentially provide this price signal as well. And so that's the next thing we want to talk about, is dynamic pricing and a dynamic pricing experiment that we've done. And here, but before I do that, I just want to distinguish between describe 3 things. The first is dynamic versus TOU, and this idea of what's called, I'll call, symmetric treatment of consumers and producers. This is what characterizes the goods, every other good we buy, except for electricity. And the reason is because in the case of electricity, we have this initial conditions that essentially, because of regulation, you get what would be called a free hedge against wholesale price uncertainty. And in particular, you get essentially the right to purchase as much as you want at a fixed price, which is a wonderful thing, but not essentially sustainable. And this asymmetric treatment has some real problems with implementing dynamic pricing, as we'll describe. So again, dynamic pricing is retail prices that vary with the real-time system conditions. So depending upon what the hourly wholesale price is, you will pay potentially a different price for electricity on your retail electricity bills. But as it says, it requires an hourly meter to actually implement. You got to measure the customer's consumption every hour of the day. Here, TOU pricing is 2 fixed prices, which makes it one better than one fixed price. And what it means is a low price, say, for example, from midnight to 12 p.m. each day, or in 6 p.m. to midnight every day, and a high price during the noon to 6 p.m. But the point here is that that's every single day. It doesn't matter if it's sunny, it doesn't matter if it's windy, it doesn't matter what exactly is going on. But the good news is it doesn't require an hourly meter. It just requires a meter that can throw consumption into 2 buckets. The peak period bucket, the off-peak period bucket, and that's it. But the bad news is it doesn't do much. Whereas dynamic pricing essentially creates what you could think of as negawatts, meaning reductions that are responsive to the hourly price. It essentially, and which has the benefit in terms of wholesale markets of facing the suppliers in the market with essentially a downward sloping demand curve, meaning that if they attempt to raise prices, they will sell less. Whereas with time of use pricing, I'm still selling into a wholesale market that effectively is no elasticity whatsoever in real time. And it's a wonderful world for me as a supplier to sell into a market when I know what the demand is. The simplest way to describe it would be, is imagine going to buy a car and having someone go into the car dealership before you and tell the car dealer that he will buy a car. Doesn't matter what the price is, but he'll buy a car. I don't think you'll get a very good deal. So essentially, the other is that because of TOU pricing, it's same price regardless every single day, the customer has no incentive to shift away from the peak periods when system conditions are stressed. They just simply have an incentive to all the time, once and for all, shift away from that higher price period, but that's it. No additional incentive in response to real-time system conditions. Does not create these negawatts, as we'd call them. So, symmetric treatment of consumers and producers. In all markets, the way things work is the price that the consumer pays is the price that the producer receives. That is essentially the default price. The way that it typically plays out, that you get this difference between the two prices, is if someone signs a hedging agreement. So a good example of a hedging agreement is the airline industry. You can show up at the gate. You can decide, all right, I'm going to fly from A to B, and I can always show up at the gate and buy my ticket. Now, the downside of that is the price can be extremely volatile. In fact, it can be infinite if the price is sold out. And so what happens is consumers hedge that risk. They essentially purchase what in standard sort of economic language would be a forward contract. You're buying a forward contract to fly on that date. That is hedging your price risk associated with that air travel. The thing is that in electricity, that's what we don't currently have. We essentially give people the right to purchase all they want at some fixed price set by the regulator. Well, in the vertically integrated regime that we're with regulation, that worked just fine. And the reason it worked just fine is because all the regulated firm had to worry about is the total amount of money that gets poured into the bucket bigger than the total amount of money that I pay out? And the reason that he didn't have to worry about anything else is because of the fact that that firm was the franchise monopoly for the service territory. It essentially could prevent all competitors from coming in to compete with it. Well, in virtually all the wholesale markets, there is typically competition to supply electricity. And the other is that it was simply based upon the cost of the service that the regulated price was set, rather than the wholesale price was a determinant of what the retail price was. And so, as I said right here, it's very difficult in a wholesale market regime for you to set a fixed retail price that guarantees that no matter what happens, you're going to always cover your wholesale energy costs. In large part, that was the California electricity crisis. Fixed retail price was set. The utilities that had to sell at that fixed retail price did not hedge that risk. Because they did not hedge that risk, wholesale prices got really, really high, and essentially they could not afford to essentially continue to sell electricity at that fixed price, buying out of a wholesale market that set an extremely high price because of other factors such as the low water levels that existed in the West and the like. So the basic challenge is that you've got to essentially have this hedge of the retail market, and this is how electricity is bought and sold in the wholesale market. One of the lessons of the crisis was that the California Public Utilities Commission learned that they needed to hedge the wholesale market's obligations of the large retailers, but the next step of then making sure that then the retailers hedge that risk with consumers is still not yet in place. And that's essentially where symmetric treatment comes in, as we'll discuss. So the idea is, this is one of the ones that's often difficult to explain, but folks will say, oh, a fixed retail price protects consumers from volatile wholesale prices. And the answer that I would give is no, it just has them pay for it on the installment plan. And the simple reason is because what has to hold over the year is that the total amount of retail revenues collected from consumers has got to be more than the cost of the wholesale power purchased, plus the transmission charges paid, plus the distribution charges paid, or the retailer goes bankrupt. And so the basic conclusion is that you can't protect consumers from volatile wholesale prices by setting a fixed retail price. You simply prevent them from taking actions to limit wholesale price volatility and reduce their monthly bill. And moreover, you effectively kill all of the economics of the energy storage demand flexibility investments that you'd like to see to deal with intermittency. In other words, if I pay 10 cents a kilowatt hour for all kilowatt hours, there's nothing there in terms of financing the storage investments to finance the demand flexibility investments and the like. Even though wholesale prices, as you'll see, can be extremely volatile. So now the question of politically, if you like, acceptable dynamic pricing. So the simple problem is the first step would always be is, look, the easiest thing is just pass through the hourly wholesale price and the retail price. That typically, that certainly is the standard economist solution. The argument always made against this is, oh, consumers are going to have to stay at home and watch the wholesale price every hour of every day and decide whether or not they want to be responsive. And and because there could be potentially a cost to taking action on the part of the consumer, they're not going to want to do that. So we're not going to get as much demand reductions in response to high wholesale prices as we'd like. I just give an example of this saying that, I have a psychic cost of $5, I have an average demand of 2.5, I can reduce my consumption by 20% by some intervention. The sort of amount of wholesale price that's necessary to get me to reduce is roughly a $10,000 wholesale price. So, but the one way around that is to say the duration of high prices. If the duration of high prices necessary to get me to take action is longer, then essentially I can amortize that over more hours, and so I don't need as high a price. And so one of the things that's been done is to try to come up with mechanisms that are going to essentially commit to a sustained period of high retail prices as a way to overcome this cost of taking action problem. And that's where critical peak pricing come in. And what it does is it says, all right, two things, so you don't have to pay attention a whole lot. I'm going to pre-commit to a maximum number of periods when you're going to have to do something, say 10. The other is I'm going to pre-commit to a sustained period, say 4 to 6 hours during the middle of the day. And in that sense, it's going to make it much easier for you, consumer, to be responsive. But the only problem is with the critical peak is it does create this, what you could call moral hazard problem, in the sense that declaring a critical peak day typically means the retailer gets to charge an extremely high price during the peak periods of that day. And if you're a profit maximizing retailer, you're very unlikely to not call all your critical peak days simply because you earn a whole lot more money on the critical peak days. So another way around it is to what's called go with a critical peak with rebate. This addresses the moral hazard problem, and it appeals to American sensibilities, meaning it appeals to the fact that you can't lose, as we'll see in a minute. And the idea here is that what you have is during the critical peak period, rather than pay according to a very high price, all right, what you do instead is you get a rebate if you reduce your consumption relative to some reference level. So for example, some reference level gets set for me, and if I get my consumption below that level, they will pay me, the retailer will pay me a rebate time on the difference between my reference level and my actual consumption. So the nice thing about this is that it does address this moral hazard problem, because the retailer, if he declares a critical peak day on a day that's very easy for you to get below your reference level, you can essentially make lots of money getting a big, big rebate. So the retailer now has an incentive only declare these events when he really does expect to essentially save in wholesale purchase costs more than he has to pay you in a rebate. But there's a downside. And the downside is this: you can't lose, because the difference is if you're on the rebate mechanism, you have what I like to call the option to quit. Meaning, if it's a really hot day, you know you can't get below your reference level, you just don't try. And you just continue to purchase at the standard price level that you usually purchase at. Whereas under the critical peak price, what happens is if it's a critical peak period, you pay that high price for everything you consume. So the critical peak pricing is essentially the carrot and the stick. The carrot meaning if you don't consume, you don't have to pay the high price. The stick is the same thing. Whereas in the case of the critical peak with rebate, you get the carrot, which means you get the rebate, but only if you get below the reference level. But if you don't think you can get below the reference level, you have the option to quit. So one question might be, is do these two pricing plans have the same effect even if customers face the same marginal price? And that's one of the things that we investigate with this experiment. But one of the things these are all the things we looked at. And so what we had was essentially an experiment done in the Washington, D.C. area, which is a wonderful place to do dynamic pricing experiment for anyone who's been to Washington in the summertime. And we had interval meters installed on all the customers in both the treatment and the control group. We randomly assigned customers to the hourly pricing group, to the critical peak pricing group, and the critical peak pricing with rebate group. With the hourly pricing and critical peak pricing, in order to get them to participate, we paid them an upfront payment and a payment at the end of the program because they could lose from participating in those two programs. Whereas with the critical peak with rebate, as you said, at worst you're going to do is get no rebates. So this just summarizes that. This just shows you that we did randomly sample within the district. The other thing we did is we had a number of customers to investigate the impact of technology, where a number of customers got smart thermostats installed. And what these things would do would be essentially control directly their thermostat in response to prices, as well as light up during the critical peak or high price event to remind the customer that that's what's going on so they could take additional action if they wanted. So in the case of the critical peak pricing, there was 12 days during the summer, 3 during the winter. They are basically during the hours you'd expect them to be. And the way we designed the experiment was that the customer typically paid 12 cents per kilowatt hour for electricity, and he received a rebate of 63 cents. But during a critical peak event, he paid 75 cents. Okay, so what we had was exactly the same marginal price for the rebate scheme if you were receiving a rebate, because you avoided paying the 12 cents for the power, and you got paid the 63 cents. So essentially 12 plus 63 is 75. You face the same marginal price as someone on the critical peak, but if you were a critical peak with rebate customer, you had the option to quit. So the idea was to try to see if that option to quit, how valuable was that option to quit, how did it manifest itself in the responsiveness that we got from customers. And in the interest of time, I'll just go through and say, for the critical peak events that we found substantial reductions in the range of 15 to 20% during these events, larger for the all-electric customers. The other thing that was quite surprising is for the low-income customers, the RAD customers, we could only put them on critical peak with rebate, but what we found is their reductions were largely almost double the percent reductions of standard customers on the critical peak with rebate. But in terms of the questions that we had, we saw a little evidence of this cost of taking action problem in the sense that the hourly pricing customers seemed to respond commensurate with critical peak pricing customers simply because the price difference for the reflective of the price difference between hourly pricing and critical peak pricing. So it didn't look like there was any real problem. And this was largely because of the pattern of prices that occurred during the day, as I'll discuss. But the other thing that was interesting is we found strong evidence of this option to quit. In particular, the CPR effect was roughly about 1/3 to 1/4 of the critical peak pricing effect. Meaning that the fact that the customer could quit meant that they quit quite a bit, and on average had a much lower average reduction than did customers on the critical peak with rebate. Smart thermostat certainly helped a lot as well. So the last point that I wanted to discuss is this day ahead versus real-time dynamic pricing. And here is where most of the stuff that I've discussed thus far is really day ahead, human intervention kinds of things, human intervention assisted with the smart thermostat. But in some sense, the real interesting stuff is going to come in what's called the difference between day ahead and real time. And what do I mean there is that all US wholesale markets run what's called a multi-settlement market. And the way that works is I sell my electricity in the day ahead market. And then what happens is that gives me a firm schedule. And then I can sell that power in real time, or I can buy additional power in real time. So an example would be is I'm a generator and I sell 100 megawatt hours in the day ahead market at $70, but in real time, I actually produce 110 megawatts. That implies necessarily that I'm essentially selling the additional 10 megawatts at the real-time price, which in my example is $60. Or in the case if the unit produced 95, that would imply that he had to buy out his obligation is 5 megawatts out of the real-time market at $60. So it's that fact that final demand can participate. So suppose that I expect that the day-ahead price is less than the real-time price. If I'm a flexible demand, what I can basically do is buy more in the day-ahead market and essentially sell it back in the real time by only consuming 90. So think of it as I was thinking of consuming 100, but because of the fact that the real-time price because the real-time price is expected to be higher, what I do is essentially schedule more than I think I'm going to consume, sell it back, or equivalently, I can do the opposite. If the day-ahead price is essentially more than the real-time price, I can sell and then buy back in real time and essentially do the same sort of thing. And you could think of it as this is where most of the automated response, the storage technologies can make their money is you're a storage technology, you store energy bought at the day-ahead price and potentially sell it back in real time. And what happens is that can be fairly lucrative. Now, on average, the day-ahead and real-time prices, look over here, but you can see that they're fairly similar. And the other thing you can see is they're not very large. These are prices in what's called the Southern California local pricing area. And these give the average prices in the peak period. But again, not a lot of very high prices, $50. But this shows you the price distribution in the real-time market. So this is the upper tail of the real-time price distribution. And what you can see is probably about 2% of the hours, even though 2009 was in the depths of the recession, you can see that 2% of the hours, we got prices above $500, and a number of hours we got prices way above. The other thing is the fact that at this time, the offer cap on the market was about $500. Now it's up around $1,000, so price volatility is even greater. The other side of it is the lower tail of this distribution, you can see is down here, where you can see again that the price can get negative and can get negative for 1 to 2% of the hours of the year, or even as high as 7% of the hours of the year. That means essentially you can get paid to consume electricity in real time. So you have a storage device, you can actually consume electricity in addition to what your schedule was in real time and get paid to do it, and then later sell that power back or just consume it. So the other thing to note is that the offer floor is actually even lower now in California. So there's lots more room for essentially buying in the day-ahead market, either selling back or the opposite transaction. But all of that can be done in an automated manner, and it can finance significant amounts of investment. So as I said here, is even during a period with fairly depressed prices, this sort of possibility exists as the economy picks up and the extent of renewables on the system picks up, it's gonna get even better. So the last bit is just to talk about, okay, we understand everything about the need for customers to be active participants in the market, but there's a significant bill risk associated with doing this. If every kilowatt I'm purchasing is at that real-time price, how do we manage that? Well, the interesting thing is we manage it the same way we manage our cell phone, but it gets even better. And it gets even better in the sense that rather than rolling over the minutes, I can just sell them back. And so the idea would be is customers would come in and essentially buy a load shape. And they buy a load shape at a fixed price. And so in this case, they'd buy 2 kilowatt hours flat for 10 cents. They could buy half a kilowatt hour for 6 hours a day, for 16 hours a day, for 6 days a week. And they could buy 4 hours at 15 cents for five days a week in the peak hours of the day. And this yields a load shape. And this just shows you what that would look like. It'd be this red line right here, summing up those things. And then what the customer does is just simply he buys and sells at the margin the difference between that in the real-time market. So if the blue line is his actual consumption, all he does in this period is he's selling back the difference between this and this at the real-time price, or in this case, he's buying out at that. But the nice thing is that he always has at the margin this incentive to reduce his demand during high price periods and potentially increase his demand in low price periods to perhaps store or do other kinds of things. So this is essentially a way to effectively manage the bill risk so that the customer and retailers could then come to customers, sell them this load profile, and then clear it against that. The customer could then be on some sort of critical peak pricing plan. They could, other sorts of technologies could be installed. Retailer could simply come to the customer and say, look, we know what your load shape looks like. We think certain technologies installed in your house and we know how to buy this red shape right here. We'll essentially help you do this. But the whole thing that makes it work is the fact that the customer has to be exposed to this price, or else they're not going to be willing to make this investment. And again, remember that all you're doing by setting a fixed retail price, then continuing what we have, is preventing customers from realizing these benefits. So the big issue is we said, is the metering. We're getting it. It's there. It's going to be in place. The next thing is the information. That's a lot of the things that we're particularly interested in at PEZ in terms of how do we provide information to help customers get better at doing this, as well as designing the pricing plans. How do we design these pricing plans that are going to effectively maximize both the amount of responsiveness we get, as well as the reliability of that responsiveness? And the interesting thing here is just to tweak California, is that unfortunately California is, again, far behind on this relative to other parts of the United States. And the place where it's going to be quite interesting to see is in Texas, as Texas has got a large renewable share. They have really embraced this concept. And the only thing is that's holding them back is their interval metering process is far behind what's going on in California. But they have all of the initial conditions in terms of making that happen. And so it'll be really interesting to see in terms of how that plays out. So I'll stop and open it up for questions.
Yeah, we'll start back over there.
Doesn't all this assume a pretty high degree and capability of active load management on the part of the consumer? And so is that difficult for a household to achieve with just this, well, maybe they have a smart thermostat and maybe you can program the thermostat to that load profile, but other than that, maybe is this more appropriate for small to mid-scale energy storage than it is for households?
I don't think so. I mean, you manage to purchase airline tickets, you manage to purchase your cell phone. Unfortunately, that's what you're going to have to do with electricity if what you want to do is essentially get the benefits of competition. The other is that it's just not that difficult to do. I mean, to go back to this thing right here, I can tell you the sort of the electricity geek way versus the the electricity geek way is kind of the way I described it to you, is that the customer picks what this is, but that doesn't need to happen. All you simply have to have is a retailer. He comes in, he notices what your consumption pattern looks like, and he tells you something like, would you be willing to do the following things for me when I tell you? And if you do, I will give you this amount of money rebates on your bill. These are just actions like turn off your pool pump, do this kind of things like that. And then the other is that he can say, looking at your load shape, looking at your appliance stock, I think this automated response technology could be profitable for you. And then literally all that the retailer would have to do is essentially say, your monthly bill is $50. If you do the things that we tell you to do when we tell you to do, we'll give you a $3 rebate, but everything else is being done by the retailer.
Well, I'm not sure I would do anything for a $3 rebate, but if the retailer would,
then basically you wouldn't get it. But you know, I mean, that's the way I mean, I guess what I'd say is the $3 depends on where you live. I mean, but if you live in Texas, it could be a lot more simply because you got to pay for air conditioning there. But you know, over the course of the year, I mean, that is the other side of dynamic pricing, is that it may not pay a lot of money, but the point is that simply there is a cost that people are imposing on the system. We have the technology to charge them. The other thing that I guess I'd say is we also don't know. I mean, there are, I think, many synergies that could exist in terms of how this works. The other side of it is if renewables get to be as large as it gets, price volatility is going to be off the charts, simply because of the fact that renewables cost zero to produce. They're the major problem with why we get negative prices. So you know, someone's got to be the shock absorber, and you know, buying at 50, selling at 5,000. You don't have to do that a whole lot to make a lot of money. So, but yeah, I mean, I can't disagree with the premise that if you have a small electricity bill, it's hard to get a sizable savings from being responsive, but you will.
maybe the retailer could go one step further and actually finance the installation of that automatic load control equipment on some of their larger consumers, and maybe that would solve.
Yeah, I mean, those consumers can afford to pay for it. I mean, I certainly wouldn't want anybody to install something that isn't going to pay for itself.
To what extent do you anticipate that these dynamic pricing benefits would decline as more people started to adopt them? So that $3 per month saving for the first 1 or 2% of households that could be responsive, would that go down to a 30-cent saving once we had 20 or 30% of households engaging in this market?
I don't know. I'd like to see it. I mean, I guess what as I said, the big thing is there is a massive amount of volatility between the day ahead and real-time prices. That just as you saw, even though the averages are quite similar, the differences can be quite large. The other is that you as a load can sell ancillary services, you can sell regulation reserve, other kinds of operating reserves. I guess what I'd say, if that was my problem, I'd be happy. But the point is we're never going to know unless we start. And right now in California, we're not there. Most of the United States is not there, largely because of the view that, we need to protect consumers from these volatile prices. The only place that seems to be embracing it is, as I said, is Texas. And I think that's largely because of the fact that they have a lot of renewables on the system and recognize that, and moreover, they're also their own control area, so they don't have anybody to lean on if all the wind goes away. They just simply have to make do with what they've got inside Texas, and so that means that they have to get the consumers involved. But you know, what I'd say is it's if you know, just because we don't know where it's going to stop. I mean, it'd be the same thing as saying in the case of the airline, there are a lot of customers flying on the airline that aren't price responsive, but it is the set of customers that are very price responsive that are filling the airplane that essentially allows flight frequency to be as big as it is to attract the business travelers that are effectively the ones that are willing to pay whatever it takes to fly on the flight they want. And I think it's a similar thing with the electricity.
I think we'll go way in the back there.
So would you expect that then you try to do things where you would tell people like a day in advance and a week in advance what you expect the price so that they can say, oh, tomorrow I'm not going to wash clothes, but on Wednesday I can, at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, but on Wednesday I probably will be able to, and, or tonight I should automatically have my hot water heater go up 5 degrees and then turn it off for the rest of the day, that kind of stuff.
It's not that hard. If it's really hot outside, don't do anything. I mean, that's basically it.
Except that the one thing that the consumer doesn't know is perhaps what the predictions are the next day for wind energy or what generators are going to be offline or that kind of stuff.
That's true, but I mean, it is the sort of thing that you know, certainly it's in terms of forecasting what prices are going to be, it's really easy simply because of the fact that you know, if it's really hot, there's not going to be much wind. And if it's really hot, people are going to want to run air conditioning. You know, it's not complicated to know when the times, although, you know, there's no shortage of websites that you can go to see what the price is. And I agree with providing people with information. But I guess the point that I'd make is it's much more important to address the question that the first questioner asked, which is, what price are you willing to, or what cost are you willing to take action at? For him, he said $3 isn't going to do it. Fine. But the point is I think we need to get people to see, okay, this is what it's costing you to take this action. You decide what you'd like to do. Right now, it's pretty much people just write their electricity bill each month, have no idea what they're doing as to why it's so high. And you know, that's something that has to change.
Okay, more questions. Okay, yes.
Last week's energy seminar was about taking advantage of the fact that people will respond differently if there's a low probability of a high payout as opposed to a high probability of a low payoff. So do you think there's an opportunity here to take advantage of that sort of behavioral bias?
If you want. I think that, you know, that certainly is something that I think could potentially happen. You probably don't want to tell regulators that you're taking advantage of behavioral biases and how you price. They tend to not really like that. But I suspect that in a competitive retailing environment, those sorts of tariffs might get offered. But you know, the idea is to, you know, put the infrastructure in place, treat electricity just like we treat every other product, meaning that the default price you pay is the default price that the generator receives. And if that's true, people will hedge around it and we'll find out what technologies work. We'll find out what pricing plans work. But right now, we've got this history where we're saying, look, you know, we have to set this fixed retail price, and that pretty much makes sure that none of these technologies are going to ever come about unless, of course, they come about by the fact that we subsidize them by taxing someplace else to raise the money to do that. When in fact, many of these, if the price signals were passed to consumers, would be economic decisions that the consumers would find in their interest to make.
I think we have 2 more. If you have a question, we'll go to you and then we'll go over to you. Okay, yeah.
Slightly related to the question you had me, is there, like, it's not brain surgery to know when to do things, but after a while, there's been, like, pilot projects that have shown participation fatigue because you don't get enough benefit out of it, and so after a time, they just revert back to their old behaviors. Did you notice that in any of your?
That's why you have to charge them money. You don't just rely on people to, like O-Power, where you public humiliation. I mean, if it's real money, people say, do I want to save money or not? And, you know, it's the same thing that I guess you could say, do people get fatigued by saying, I'll do a Saturday night stay over or I'll buy the cheap ticket? It becomes an economic decision. We certainly don't see any fatigue in terms of people saying, ooh, I got to save money, I'll do that. But I mean, I do think that people will figure out ways to, I mean, the other thing about all these experiments is they're pretty much one-off experiments in the sense that you're not giving people an opportunity to respond, to figure out things that they might do in response to facing prices like this. I mean, I personally think that to the extent that people start seeing these prices, they'll start figuring out ways to potentially save money. Now, you know, I agree that it's no fun, but, you know, we kind of got no choice if we're going to try to run a system with intermittent resources. Whereas, and you know, it's going to be expensive enough to run it with renewable resources as it is relative to the fossil fuel resources. But you know, if this is a way to make it a little less expensive.
Okay, we'll take the last question.
Yes, I have a quick comment and a question. The comment is in the valleys outside of this rest area, the summertime electricity bills run to $200 or $300, not $50. And I think people would be willing to save $20 on that a month, especially if it's made easy for them with automatic equipment. But my question is this: have you looked at the impact of widespread adoption on prices? You looked at, you mentioned buying at 50 and selling at 5,000. Everybody does it, it won't be 5,000. Have you looked at the impact of widespread adoption?
No, because it's not an interesting question. I mean, we're at zero. When we get bigger than zero, I'll be interested in that question, but it'll be quite some time before we get to zero. I mean, the answer, I guess what I'd say, the answer is pretty obvious. If there is widespread adoption, then prices won't be as high. But you know, and you won't get as much volatility. But you know, we're sort of every day we're transferring money by not doing anything. And if I guess what I'd say is, if the reason we're not doing is because with widespread adoption it goes away, that's not how markets work. Markets work because we do have price responsive consumers, and there's a margin at which additional consumers are unwilling to be price responsive. And what I would expect to happen is that people will make these investments in these technologies to the point that it is economic. And it is true that the sort of the first guys that get in are likely going to be the ones that make the money off of it. The later adopters are going to find that they make less and decide not to adopt, and that's perfectly fine. And that'll be the thing that's going to make the price volatility go away. But the important point is you're not going to get it unless somebody starts doing it. And you know, that's the unfortunate thing. And so it's the old saying, if you can't let the perfect be the enemy of the good, is that yes, the perfect is everybody's got them, but the good is if some of them got them, it's going to work pretty well.
Okay, well, thank you very much.
For more, please visit us at stanford.edu.